14 seconds after it began, the challenge was already over. No one in the room spoke. The fighter who had come to test Bruce Lee stood still, confused, unharmed, but unmistakably defeated. There was no exchange of blows worth describing. No visible struggle. Witnesses would later disagree on exactly what happened, but they all agreed on one thing. The outcome felt inevitable the moment Bruce Lee stepped forward. What unsettled them was not the speed. It was the restraint, and the quiet realization that the demonstration had never been meant to impress, only to end the question forever. The space was unremarkable by outward standards. A high-ceilinged studio with bare wooden floors, a few mirrors along one wall, and the faint smell of liniment that never quite left the air. No banners, no trophies, no spectacle. Only the tools of practice. Heavy bags, mitts, and the quiet discipline of repetition. This was the room where reputations were quietly tested. Not in front of cameras or crowds, but in moments when skill met scrutiny, when outsiders came to see what could not be faked. Bruce Lee moved within it as if it were simply part of his daily rhythm. He adjusted his stance, touched the mats lightly, and exhaled without announcing his presence. Yet every movement, minimal though it seemed, carried the authority of years of observation and refinement. The room attracted those who thought skill must always declare itself. Those who believed the louder they were, the stronger they appeared. For them, a challenge was a stage to prove worth, to assert dominance through motion and noise. But Bruce Lee's method was never noise. It was observation first, clarity second, and action only when absolutely necessary. The air carried the tension of expectation, though unspoken. Visitors were often surprised at how unassuming he seemed, how little he displayed, and yet, in that very calm, an invisible boundary was drawn. One did not need to see a fight to know what mastery looked like. It could be felt in the stillness, the weight of a presence, the precision of movement in even the smallest gestures. When the challenger would arrive, he would enter a room that had already decided, silently, how encounters would unfold. Here, in this quiet, almost ordinary environment, the stage was set not for spectacle, but for inevitability. The wooden floor creaked under his steps as he paced briefly, measuring, expecting, though not fully aware of what awaited him. The mirrors reflected him back, confident and prepared, yet failing to show the subtle lines of anticipation etched into Bruce Lee's face. Here, in the stillness, the first rules of the encounter were already written. Observation before action, clarity before reaction, restraint before demonstration. The room was simple, yet it held a weight far beyond its walls. Those who entered often remarked later that it seemed smaller than imagined. Yet the air inside was heavy with expectation. Every motion mattered. Every silence spoke volumes. Bruce Lee's gaze remained calm, controlled, unhurried. No one in the room could yet measure the depth of his focus, but even the casual observer might sense the difference. Some presences command attention without seeking it. In that room, Bruce Lee had claimed that space long before anyone else arrived. Time in the room did not stretch or contract. It simply existed as it always had, quietly marking the moments before the inevitable demonstration. There were no gestures to taunt, no pretense of intimidation. And yet, by the time the challenger stepped fully inside, the atmosphere had already shifted. Here mastery waited. He entered with certainty, not arrogance exactly, but the firm belief that his credentials and experience could carry him through anything. A full-contact fighter, seasoned in the ring, he had tested himself against numerous opponents. His body moved with the ease of repetition, each step and adjustment practiced thousands of times, each muscle anticipating resistance and ready to strike. From the start, his intent was clear. He did not come to learn. He came to measure, to assert, to confirm a pre-existing notion. That skill could be proven in action, that confidence could demand respect. His voice, when it broke the silence, carried that certainty. There was a challenge there, yes, but it was subtle. A smirk, a slight adjustment of stance, a glance toward the room, testing not Bruce Lee, but the witnesses. Yet Bruce Lee made no response. He did not mirror the bravado. He did not step forward or rise to the psychological bait. His posture remained relaxed, the slightest bend in the knees, weight evenly distributed, hands hanging loosely. He allowed the fighter to move, to posture, to speak without interruption. In this calm, the contrast became immediately evident. One man relied on outward confidence, the other on an inward certainty invisible to casual observers. The challenger, confident in his approach, likely assumed that silence would provoke hesitation or reveal weakness. He adjusted, raised his guard, tested distance with a jab or two, but Bruce's movements remained measured, minimal, unprovoked. Every twitch, every shift of weight, every blink was deliberate, nothing wasted. In these moments, the public nature of the challenge began to weigh on the fighter. He was performing, and yet performing for an audience that already sensed the imbalance. Witnesses later noted the subtle psychological shift that began even before contact was made. The challenger's certainty was challenged, not by force, but by the quiet authority radiating from Bruce Lee. Each observer felt it differently. Some as an unease, others as a slow tightening of the room's energy. Still, outwardly, nothing appeared extraordinary. There was only posture, gaze, and a controlled stillness that somehow expanded the boundaries of the space itself. The room seemed to contract around the fighter. His confidence, once so firm, began to encounter resistance, not physical but psychological. He realized, too late, that the question he had come to answer could not be measured in strikes or counters alone. The authority of restraint, of precise judgment, and of absolute calm was not something he could test with the methods he knew. And yet, he did not retreat. He could not. Social expectation, ego, and the quiet weight of witnesses held him in place. His mind raced to adjust, to find a way to impose his skill. Yet every shift only highlighted the difference between noise and clarity, display and mastery. By the time the room had reached its unspoken tension, the contrast was undeniable. One man carried confidence as a shield, the other carried certainty as a quiet force, nearly imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. It was here, in this subtle divergence, that the eventual outcome had already begun to form, not as speculation, but as inevitability. The room was no longer just a space. It had become a witness. Every observer present, trainers, students, casual onlookers, felt a shift in the atmosphere that was almost tactile. Silence, already profound, carried weight. Every movement by the challenger seemed amplified, every pause noticed. Even breathing was perceptible, measured against the calm of Bruce Lee, whose own motions barely disturbed the air. No one spoke, yet tension grew. It was not the tension of fear, but the tension of anticipation. The full-contact fighter, accustomed to arenas and controlled bouts, now faced a different kind of scrutiny. The audience was not judging technique alone. They were registering restraint, timing, presence. In their quiet observation, they became participants, witnesses to a lesson unfolding with no announcement. The fighter attempted small maneuvers, testing distance with jabs, shifts in stance, subtle feints. Each action met only with measured observation. Bruce Lee did not react, yet each pause carried meaning. The lack of response became a mirror, reflecting every assumption the challenger held about himself. Every motion made him aware of what he did not control, the psychological space that Bruce Lee occupied effortlessly. This was the moment when public pressure began to bear down. Observers noticed small details: the tightening of the challenger's jaw, the micro-adjustments in balance, the way his eyes darted toward Bruce for any sign of weakness. The calm presence in front of him, so deceptively unassuming, became a silent adjudicator of skill. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, not because a strike was imminent, but because the inevitable was already approaching. The psychological weight did not arrive suddenly. It was cumulative. Each observer contributed without speaking. Each quiet shift of posture, each minimal gesture by Bruce Lee, reinforced the boundary of certainty he had established. The challenger, trained to respond to movement and aggression, now confronted a different metric. Stillness as mastery, observation as dominance. By the time 14 seconds would pass, the stage had been set not by action, but by presence. The challenger's confidence, once absolute, had begun to waver subtly, almost imperceptibly. Yet he remained committed to the encounter, bound by ego and expectation. The room waited, not for the fight to unfold, but for a demonstration that would quietly, decisively, end the question of skill without the need for spectacle. The observers, sensing the shift, leaned in silently. They knew something definitive was about to happen, though they could not yet articulate how it would unfold. In this suspended moment, the concept of power was redefined, not as what one could strike, but as what one could command without striking at all. The moment began without warning, yet it was deliberate. 14 seconds, no more, no less, would mark the encounter in memory far longer than any fight that lasted hours. There was no flourish, no prelude of motion. Bruce Lee stepped forward, measured, his eyes calm, absorbing the space and the opponent within it. Every movement was efficient, stripped of excess, as though he had calculated the outcome before he ever entered the room. The challenger reacted instinctively, relying on trained reflexes, expecting the familiar rhythm of combat. But there was no rhythm to follow. Bruce's actions were minimal yet decisive, precise enough to demonstrate control without the need for force. The strikes, if they could be called that, barely grazed physical space. The techniques seemed almost invisible to those not looking closely. Yet the effect was undeniable. Balance shifted, center of gravity subtly compromised, and a psychological conclusion was drawn before the body ever felt impact. Observers later argued over what had actually occurred. Some swore they saw a deflection, a step, a touch that was enough to unbalance a fighter trained to resist force. Others insisted nothing touched him. Yet every witness agreed on one thing. The outcome was immediate, complete, and irrevocable. The challenger froze, not in pain, not in fear, but in the sudden realization that the contest was decided. In that short span, Bruce Lee's mastery revealed itself not through display, but through silence and economy. Every movement served the purpose of clarity, clarity that the question posed by the challenge could no longer exist. There was no spectacle, no theatrics, only the quiet articulation of skill in its purest form. The room itself seemed to acknowledge it. Silence deepened, pressing in heavier now with understanding. The onlookers, all witnesses to the brief demonstration, felt the shift as if the very air had changed. What had taken 14 seconds to unfold would be retold for years, not for the speed, but for the inevitability. The fighter, once brimming with confidence, did not fall or collapse. He simply stopped. Stopped moving, stopped calculating, stopped expecting. And in that stillness, he understood something that could not be conveyed through words. The lesson was not in the force applied. It was in the restraint, the precision, the quiet certainty of a master. When the 14 seconds ended, Bruce Lee took no step backward, no victory gesture. He simply returned to his neutral stance, the motion almost imperceptible. Yet the effect lingered. It was a demonstration that left no room for doubt, a conclusion drawn in silence, witnessed by all but explained to none. The room remained still long after the 14 seconds had passed. The challenger did not collapse, did not cry out, did not raise a hand in surrender. And yet, something had shifted irreversibly. The confidence he had carried into the room, the certainty of his own skill, the assumption that credentials and experience guaranteed respect, had dissolved quietly, invisibly. He looked around, attempting to anchor himself in the reactions of others, but the witnesses offered no guidance. Their faces were calm, composed, almost neutral, yet their quiet observation carried weight. It was in this space, suspended between action and consequence, that the true impact of Bruce Lee's demonstration settled in. The fighter understood, without a word being spoken, that the question he had brought to the room had been answered. There was no embarrassment in his expression, only the subtle recognition of something he could not measure in conventional terms. He had faced an authority that did not announce itself, that did not posture, and in that silent authority, he found an unyielding benchmark he could not challenge. The collapse was not of the body, it was of assumption, of expectation, of the belief that mastery could be confronted as one might confront mere competition. Witnesses later described a strange clarity in the room. It was as if time had slowed, not in duration, but in significance. Every eye noted the contrast. The challenger, rigid and aware, yet entirely without agency over the situation. Bruce Lee, calm, collected, having applied the smallest possible action to resolve the largest possible question. The lesson, though unspoken, became undeniable. Dominance was not measured in visible force. Psychological presence, restrained application of skill, and precise observation created an authority that no outward display could match. Those present could sense the lingering weight of it, the quiet understanding that one's assumptions could be rendered irrelevant without spectacle, without anger, without struggle. The challenger left the room the same way he entered, physically intact, uninjured, yet subtly altered. Even in silence, the outcome was profound. The spectators, too, carried the residue of what had occurred. It was not a story of triumph in the traditional sense, but a demonstration of mastery that reshaped their understanding of skill, authority, and the power of restraint. By the time the room returned to its normal cadence, the echoes of those 14 seconds remained. The encounter had left an imprint on everyone present, a quiet benchmark of what true mastery looked like. Not loud, not forceful, but absolute in its clarity and inevitability. Years passed, yet the story never truly faded. There were no headlines, no viral footage, no exaggerated retellings. Only quiet accounts, shared among those who had been present, and gradually passed to others who sought to understand what mastery could look like when stripped of spectacle. The 14-second encounter became less about Bruce Lee's victory and more about the nature of authority itself. Trainers, students, and casual witnesses spoke of it in hushed tones, often framing it as a turning point in their own understanding of skill. They did not describe technique in detail. That was unnecessary. The demonstration had proved its point without embellishment. Its power lay in its simplicity and restraint. For the challenger, the memory lingered not as shame, but as an indelible lesson. He had confronted someone whose skill transcended conventional measures. Over time, he carried the understanding that true mastery is recognized not in struggle or competition, but in precision, clarity, and the quiet assertion of control. The experience informed his later practice, his approach to teaching, and his comprehension of martial skill far more than any extended match ever could. Observers, too, reflected on what they had witnessed. Some adjusted their training, seeking efficiency over volume, insight over ego. Others simply carried the memory as a subtle benchmark, a reminder that restraint often speaks louder than action, and that psychological authority can precede and ultimately replace physical force. The room where it occurred remained unchanged, yet imbued with a quiet significance. New students felt it without fully understanding why. Visitors sensed that certain moments carried weight beyond their immediate perception. Bruce Lee's presence, though absent from those later years, lingered in that space like an unspoken standard, and so the 14 seconds endured, not as a story of triumph or dominance, but as a reference point for what mastery could embody. It became a lesson embedded in memory and retelling, that clarity, precision, and calm authority could resolve questions that confidence and force never could. The incident shaped reputations without spectacle, influenced practice without preaching, and passed on a quiet truth that would resonate long after the participants had moved on. Its legacy was not in the event itself, but in the understanding it left behind. A silent benchmark, a moment when mastery spoke louder than motion, and when restraint carried a weight no strike ever could.